Each day, we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Hi, I'm Chelsey Youman, your host for Point of View. This is the Millennial Roundtable, where we cover current events, everything going on in this world, but with a millennial perspective. And today we have just a great show lined up for you. We have a few guests in addition to me. I'm Chelsey Youman, and I'm the Texas State Director with Human Coalition Action, which is the largest pro-life ministry in the country. I'm on their advocacy arm. But joining us today, we also have Jonathan Teague, and he is currently the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. And he is there doing the great work, serving ministry. I'm sure your ministry looks a little bit different right now, Jonathan, but thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, Chelsey, it's great to be with you again, and always great to be on the program and talking together. Yeah, it's definitely a unique time for sure, and but it's always great to be with you guys.
Well, thanks for joining us today. You know, the news doesn't stop, and our opinions certainly don't stop during this time. So I'm just grateful that you would join us today and help us really just go into everything going on right now, especially in a world that's kind of topsy-turvy. And you work directly with millennials, especially, you know, young married adults at your church. So I know that you probably have a lot of insight right now into what's going on. So I definitely want to get to that this hour. We're also going to look at talking at how, you know, really the economic downturn is the second big recession that we've had as millennials. And so I would like to talk about that this hour. And then also just get an update, give an update from the pro-life movement and see, you know, how we're getting an opportunity to really serve more women than ever, help more women than ever in their circumstances. And there is a lot of hope to be found in that. Through, you know, the storms that everybody's in right now, there's actually a lot of service and opportunity to be done. And then maybe a little bit later, we'll get to some more political topics throughout the show. So we've got a big lineup today, whether that's going to be former Vice President Joe Biden's VP pick, China's disinformation that they've spread about the virus, and some hot water therein for that. We've got quite a bit of topics to cover, but thank you, Jonathan, for joining us again. I want to dive right in and just talk about a little bit about how the economy specifically impacts millennials. And Jonathan, I know that this is a topic you sent out earlier and originally because you're probably seeing this firsthand in your ministry. But to give our audience a little bit of a background, this is the second once-in-a-lifetime downturn at a crucial moment. And the Atlantic article talks about, we have it posted on pointofview.net for those who are interested in hearing more. But, you know, the truth is, as millennials, I'm an older millennial, we entered the workforce during the big downturn in 2008. And many of us, large percentage of us, took months to find jobs after college, or for me, after law school. You know, you always think that even people with graduate degrees or lawyers, you know, firms are just going to hire them up automatically. And most firms were actually on a hiring freeze when I graduated law school. So it took me 6 months to find a place, when things started to look better at that time. So we certainly in our lives have seen just economic crisis after crisis at really pivotal moments. And this article highlights that. It talks about how, you know, the original downturn led to lower wages. So millennials came out of college with college degrees, working the same jobs that previous generations had worked, but for the same price, and salary rate that had been going on 20 and 30 years before. And so,
right.
There's lower salaries, which we know follow us the rest of our lives. And then now in a time where we're supposed to be saving and having our nest eggs, and we're paying for childcare and things that everybody in the working class is working, towards, we statistically have less of a nest egg saved up, less assets, less home buying saved up. And in general, now they're the largest generation being laid off or furloughed.
Right.
Right. Yeah. I hate to start with this, but the truth is, this is very important, because this article discusses, statistically speaking, that truly our generation will be the first generation in history, perhaps, to be poorer than any generation before it. And so I wanted to open the floor to you, Jonathan, and get your thoughts on this and see what your experience with this has been, even in ministry.
Yeah, and it is great to be with you again, Chelsey, and hope you're doing well. Hope your family's well. To everybody listening today, obviously, I think it goes without saying these days, one of the things that we all can be more vigilant about and be more, I think, just aware of in general is just taking care of each other, and neighboring well, because there's so many implications to that. Certainly for us as believers, Jesus told us to do it, but just in general right now, I think the boiling point, maybe we've passed it in some places, maybe it's coming in others, but I think you can feel sort of this national restlessness, where nationally and then just locally, I think we're all sort of asking ourselves, what's the next in all of this process? Because it is, in many ways, it has some precedent historically in our country, and then in other ways, it's very unprecedented. And of course, that's true as well when we get into these generational distinctives. And I thought that that article you and I've read that Annie Lowry wrote for The Atlantic about 10 days ago, and who knows how many of those numbers have changed in the last week. Mm-hmm. But I mean, think about that. 60 or 52% of people under the age of 45 have lost a job in America. And then there's an attached report that she put inside that article that unpacks it even more. That really, Chelsey, it's not only that and the realities of all that, but then it's what's coming next as a result of that. So it's sort of like that initial first impact of furloughing, job loss, and reduction and things like that. Then it's the residual impact for young adults in particular of what will that look like in 90 days, 120 days, and a year from now. And so, yeah, for sure, in the church context, obviously, what we're focusing a lot of our conversation, both in older adults that I connect with and work with, and then young people that I still disciple and talk with. It's interesting. I talked to somebody in our church not long ago in their 60s that lost their job and had been with an organization for a long, long time. And it was just horrible. It was the same week that the market crashed, so to speak. It was just horrible. And then at the same time, we've got several friends we know that are spread out all over the country and here in Texas as well, where, yeah, it's just so real. And I think you're right. And the point of that article is so well said is, I mean, it's really, I think it is going to scar the psyche of millennials in a lot of ways. Because in so many ways, Chelsey, we were told that, we were going to be the generation of awesomeness and, that things were going to be great. We were going to have more money and more stuff than our parents. And, your house will be as big now as your parents was when they were 50. Everything that they had is going to be better for you. And we know historically that that's a byproduct of what, frankly, our parents were told, is that, hey, you're not going to be raised in a depression. You're not going to have world wars. We're going to vaccinate people. And, I mean, I think it's important historically to remember over the last 60 or 70 years, the things that by and large don't kill people anymore necessarily.
Right.
Where 100 years ago, that wasn't our grandparents, our great-grandparents. They were born in a completely different world.
That's so true. That's so true, Jonathan. And we've got to take one of those breaks really quick. But when we get back, we're going to hear more from Jonathan about, these generation gaps and changes that we're all going to be overcoming really together as a society. So join us after this. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
How many Americans have died of the coronavirus? You might think the answer to that question would be fairly simple. After all, we have the bodies in morgues and funeral homes that we can count. That is true, but how many of those people died of the virus becomes a more difficult question to answer. Most media reports argue that we have had a significant undercount, even in this country. It isn't because government officials are trying to hide anything. It is due to the widespread lack of testing, especially in the early weeks of the outbreak. Also, people dying at home aren't usually tested, and even some who die at a hospital or a nursing home may not be tested because the medical examiners are overburdened in many of the nation's hotspots. In order to counter this disparity, New York City last week decided to add 3,700 people to its death tolls. They presumed they died of the virus. That addition increased the U.S. death toll by 17%. And it's worth mentioning that Ohio also had included people in the death toll whom they suspected of having the virus. But is it possible that instead of an undercount, we might have an overcount? Dr. Anthony Fauci has dismissed this concern as merely a conspiracy theory, but Dr. Deborah Birx explained in a recent press briefing that people are counted as victims of the pandemic if they tested positive for the coronavirus, even if something else caused their death. This raises an important distinction between dying from the virus versus dying with the virus. And I'm not just playing with prepositions. If you died of cancer or a heart attack, but also tested positive for COVID-19, you are listed as a victim of the pandemic. As you can see, getting an accurate number of the coronavirus deaths isn't so easy. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host for Point of View. This is the Millennial Roundtable. Thank you for joining us today. I am joined with Jonathan Teague, and he is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So I'm grateful to have him with us today. We are discussing how the economic downturn during this time is really the second great economic downturn that the millennial generation has, how we've been impacted by it. I know everyone's always impacted by economic downturn, but, we were the first generation to really be graduating in a time where no one was hiring and face unemployment from the get-go, lower salaries than previous generations. When you account for all of course, inflation and all that. And now in a time where we're trying to save and rebuild for our futures, we are the largest generation being furloughed during all of this crisis. So we are talking a little bit about that. And Jonathan had such great points before about really how this impacts our psyche long term. So welcome, Jonathan. Do you want to continue the discussion on what you were saying before the break?
Oh, for sure, Chelsey. Yeah. And I think, we were talking about just the reality of what the effect has been, both now and moving forward. And I think that's what's so interesting about with millennials in particular, is this idea of, things, a lot of the narrative, growing up in many ways for a lot of young adults was, man, things are probably going to get better, not worse. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, that was the mantra of the 90s. And as older millennials kind of grew into the 2000s, like you were saying, I bought my first home in 2005. And, it was relatively easy to do, which I thought was kind of peculiar because we didn't have a whole lot of money. But then just a few years later, you start finding out that, well, other people were doing that on a much higher level and the damage that it caused, and then all of the things that spun from that. So I love what you were saying a minute ago about how just coming into the job market, it was not necessarily what we were told or what we thought that it would be. And now here we go again, right? And the difference now is that this isn't the reality of poor economic choices or maybe a system that had some leakage along the way and best practices. This is a biological event, and it's worldwide. So if you walk it back from 9/11, domestic terrorism, being at war in different parts around the world, financial recession, and now, a biological reality, it's like there's almost no category left for something bad not to happen in. And I think the net effect of that, and I don't think we should overstate those kind of things, Chelsey, but I do think at the same time for a number of young adults, particularly living in large cities, that's a lot of the mentality. And I think what's going to be interesting, really, I know you're a fan of data and obviously a lot of that information tells us a story. I think the next run of data is what's going to be really interesting. Like a year from now, what is the job market going to look like? What are people's rhythms going to look like? What are companies going to do? Because going back to that Atlantic article, and this is a pretty widely agreed upon number, but the average millennial, quote unquote, has somewhere in the neighborhood already of $33,000 of debt. So, the stimulus check being what it was and all of the debate surrounding about that, whether we should or shouldn't, not enough, too much. But the reality is even that, our government's best attempt to do something to mitigate the damage there of, necessarily half a generation of a workforce not having employment, because of the existing debt issues. Like it's almost a wash in a lot of young adults' minds.
Right.
So I think as a result, right, it creates more, if we think about it from the spiritual space, it creates more tension, more anxiety, more skepticism, more doubt. Now we know that the gospel has answers for all of that, but when we get into the weeds of talking with and encouraging and praying with young adults in particular, this is a lot of what we're hearing.
Yes. I mean, it's certainly, we know that every single generation has faced colossal challenges. I mean, we can't overstate that enough. Our generation's challenges have not yet been a world war, but it looks different. There's other challenges. And certainly, the article in the Atlantic really brought to light, it said, we tried, our generation statistically, for the most part, did things by the book. They went and got higher educations. They entered the workforce. They're trying to do things the best they can. I don't know if you're like me or if this is just anecdotal, but I've often heard from older generations, well, you guys, we've all heard about the entitlement that our generation has, but,
right,
wanting more salary than maybe they should, or even just student loans. That is something that is a little bit new, that's newer to our generation than previous generations. Most other generations did not have student loans. I think the article said that the cost of higher education grew by 7% per year through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, faster than the overall rate of inflation, leaving millennials to have to borrow the debt in order to go to college. And so this system just looked really different when we were doing it than it had for previous generations. And I know that left us not just with, difficulty in entering the job market during the Great Recession, but also entering the job market with unprecedented amount of debts generationally. And so all of this has just led to, really, in my mind, a bigger picture issue about the way the system works. And competition is always, for me, going to be the answer to some of these issues. But I look at this a little bit broader as well in light of the coronavirus and realize that we can get our economy started again. We are not weak Americans, and we're strong Americans, and we can make choices for ourselves. Americans want to work right now, and we're seeing that across the entire country with protests saying, let us work. And, if our generation, if we're younger, if we don't have vulnerable health at this time, for the most part, my generation is ready to get back to work, and we don't want to be the ones furloughed. We want to continue to provide for our families at a time where we now do have children. We have 20 million children, millennials, the millennial generation has 20 million children that are not in school right now that need food. And so just thinking through, even on a broader scale, understanding that the economic impact, I think it's been a little bit downplayed, especially in most media outlets, that, we're willing to sacrifice anything, to protect our society. And we are, but we know more now about this virus than we did a week ago and a month ago and 2 months ago. Right. And I think this gradual reopening of the economy, even here in Texas with Governor Abbott, phasing in a reopen for the economy, those are the types of things that our generation is looking forward to and ready for, so that we can get back to work and really restabilize our economy from what has been just a huge, huge overhaul for everyone, obviously. And then the other thing I'll add to that is Texas, this first hour, we have Texas listeners. We are the 11th largest economy. If we were our own country, which many people have bumper stickers about, we're the 11th largest economy in the world when you put it all together. Oil and gas, trade, all of that. And so the impact to Texas could be close to even, I've heard, $10 billion if we don't really get on top of this. And not that everything, comes back to the economy in our pocketbooks, but at the end of the day, we have to look at this in a holistic sense. And I think, the healthcare industry has done an incredible job advising us and giving us information and learning as fast as they physically can about this virus and antibodies and how to combat it. And then, but it is, in a lot of sense, our government's job and our society's job to look at the other facets of society that have come to a grinding halt and say, what is the best, most, wise course and discerning course of action to protect not just our generation, but the generations after us from other calamity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and so again, to me, Chelsey, and I think you're right. I think that's that we were talking earlier. That's sort of that rising tension that you're feeling nationally. I mean, you can hear it in President Trump's press conferences, and you can obviously you see it through the various media outlets and broadcasts. And I think everybody's sort of on that tipping point of being ready for the next. And I don't know, to me, I just think that this is a time for our generation, and your point is so well made. Every generation has their menu of crazy stuff that they had to go through. And I mean, if you think about it, our parents and grandparents, my goodness, world wars. I mean, my grandfather was born in 1906, so he was alive for both world wars and, obviously the Cold War. I mean, his entire life, he didn't die until 1998. So he watched the conclusion of all three of those massive events, landing on the moon, civil rights, all these different things. Those are massive generational moments. Mm-hmm. Ours are of a different kind because of how global we are now. So, right. So there's still political tension, there's still ideological tension, but more and more and more, America and the world we're globalizing at such a fast rate. So maybe our conflicts aren't going to be, through national borders. Maybe it's going to be more issues like this.
Global issues.
Major events.
That's right. Well, we've got to take one of those breaks, Jonathan, but everybody come back after this because we've got more to discuss on the economy and the coronavirus.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman. I'm your host for Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable today. We're discussing a lot of current events, specifically some of the generational impacts and challenges we faced, for the millennial generation. This is really our second huge economic downturn in pivotal moments in our life. And so here to discuss that with me is Jonathan Teague on the line. He's the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. And I'm so grateful to have him join us today. Thank you for being with us, Jonathan.
You bet, Chelsey. Great to be with you.
Yes, well, we've been talking just about how every generation has faced challenges that are unprecedented, it almost seems like, at various times. With obviously our generation, it's been a little bit more economic, I would say, challenges, but you could say 9/11. We have seen the war in the Middle East in our generation. All of those have had huge impacts on us, but we've been really highlighting how detrimental the economic crisis our generation has seen twice now will statistically lead to us being the first generation ever to be poorer than the generation before. And so we were touching on that, but saying that no doubt every generation has faced its own challenges, right, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, you think about if you stepped outside, so Spanish flu was a real thing in America in the fall of 1918 and the 1919, and a lot's been said about that, right? But if you stepped outside your door in like the fall of 1918, say in Baltimore, for instance, Chelsey, and you wanted to go gather with tens of thousands of other people, which in those days there weren't big stadiums and, there were some baseball parks, but getting with 40,000 other people was like a once-in-a-lifetime event. And you didn't want to miss it. You walk outside, you do that, you don't socially distance, there's no contact tracing, and that afternoon you've got flu, and maybe a few days later you're no longer with us. And that was the last time, with some degree of difference in America where we saw that kind of contagion potential. Some are saying since now COVID-19, and I think just if we have any kind of comparison from our story as a nation of times when it's like, hey, this is real. We have to make radical paradigm shifts and changes, at least temporarily. It's right now. And in fact, if you go back and you read, years after, World War I just ended, millions had died, America was ready to celebrate the end of it, the victory of it, and then right on top of that is this massive sweeping disease that's killing tens of thousands of people. And, parallels in history are always dangerous, but, 2016 election, the economy starts booming. Even if you're not a Republican or you didn't vote for President Trump, you see your 401k going up and to the right. You think, man, I can't argue with some of these results. And then almost like overnight, coronavirus becomes this sweeping problem throughout the world and all the economic impact that comes from it. You can argue as millennials, we have not in our lifetime seen anything to the degree of like this. And I've been telling people for weeks now, Chelsey, you're gonna tell your kids, I'm gonna tell my kids, and our grandkids about the spring and summer of 2020. For sure. This is going to be something we're going to look back on and go, do you remember wearing masks and gloves and quarantining and all these different things? And I just think that when you go through defining moments like this as a generation, and this for sure is, I think, Chelsey, it's an opportunity for us to acquire some generational maturity. And what I mean by that is this, is that right now, I think you said this earlier, and I love this. It's sort of the character of a people and of a nation and a culture this is the crucible, right? Mm-hmm. So how are we going to respond through it? And not just as we're living in it, but coming out of it. And, are we going to care for each other? Are we going to value healthcare workers like never before? Yet simultaneously, man, the guy that's working down the street at Chick-fil-A, he's got to go to work, sell some Chick-fil-A. You got to buy it. That way he can go home and turn his lights on. And so there's all these fascinating dynamics that we're living in real time. And I think, Chelsey, the narcissism, the selfishness, the self-centeredness, the entitlement, that, fair or unfair, millennials have been labeled with that, like you said earlier. There's probably some truth to that. Maybe this is a season where as a generation, we start to say, maybe there's ways we can serve, and maybe there's ways we can show honor, and maybe we can show deference to people around us as part of how we come back on this deal. Because I agree, we got to start working again. People have got to have a chance to earn an income. They've got to have a chance to traffic goods and services, and not just for the national good, but for household to household. So are there ways that we can do that? And as we do it, maybe we grow up a little bit. I don't know a better way to say it, but sometimes adversity is the only way, and we wouldn't wish this on anybody. We don't want anybody to certainly be sick or to die. I don't want anybody in my church or people I don't want that for anybody. But here's where we are. This is our moment. And I think how do we as a generation maybe lead coming out of this? Man, I think, if anything, I'd love to look back on that and see young adults standing up and being the thought leaders and the kind of the action leaders as it relates to coming back into the business world and into the social workspace and some of the other areas I know that you're passionate about. Boy, could it be that this is the leadership moment for millennials, not just the moment where we keep talking about how we've fallen behind or disadvantaged. All that's real, Chelsey, but maybe now we get to lead a little bit. We'll see.
I think that's such a great point, Jonathan, because, you know, a little bit traditionally, we are one of the most globalized generations that's ever existed. I mean, we grew up in, I think, middle school and starting in high school, depending on where you are in the millennial generation, having the internet, having email, obviously international news available to us. So we've grown up in a very globalized space where the UN has been prevalent, and our connectedness. I mean, this coronavirus is actually even a testament to how connected our society really is around the world. But for all of that, we're still one of the more isolated generations in terms of having less of support systems. They say it takes a village to raise a family. You know, and our villages are statistically smaller than generations before us. And so I think this is just, it is what you're saying, an opportunity when we look for the silver lining to say, we as a society have done incredible things on the selflessness front of this, from being willing to be furloughed, being willing to stay at home with our families, being willing to really sacrifice our children's education, the economy. I mean, our church, our very worship on Sunday mornings. I mean, you name it. Society as a whole has truly, in a very united way, frankly, agreed to protect the vulnerable among us. We need to stay home. And I think it's a testament to the goodness in humanity. And, you know, obviously among Christians, the selflessness that we profess, you know, to serve our brothers and our neighbors above ourselves. So I certainly do hope that this really kind of checks the millennial spirit on that and just says, hey, how can we lead in this? How can we serve in this? I think we're already seeing that. And I'm encouraged by that in a time where we're told constantly about the dissensions in society. We're told, I mean, if you turn on the news, you're hearing about divisions and everything is political. And I think we live in, unfortunately, I am a very black and white thinker, but there's usually a pretty clear right and wrong to me in a situation. But there's always we always have to have a dichotomy in the public space. And this has forced us to have a dialogue about the gray areas and, you know, who is the essential worker, who's not, what is, you know, how interconnected are we really? We, you know, our family has like picked our favorite restaurants that we want to do our best to support because we are interconnected. I mean, we don't want anyone being laid off. And it's forcing us to see how truly connected we are as a society. But I do hope what you're saying is true about the service end of this, because there are so many out there. We are seeing the impact on children who are in volatile homes, and high increases from hospital reporting on child abuse. I mean, checking on neighbors and depression rates and suicide rates. Those are things that we need to do as a society, in addition to protecting the vulnerable by staying home. It's also the phone calls, or even just, you know, finding a way to ask your neighbor how they're doing. And there's so many ways to serve. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We got to take one of those breaks for the last little bit of the hour, but we're going to talk about ways to serve people around you when we get back, specifically how the pro-life movement has really been impacted by this, has been predictable, I would say, in some sense. But really, I'm just so encouraged. We have so much reason to be hopeful for the way that we're seeing society come around certain subgroups among us who really do need help. And so when we get back, we're going to talk a little bit about that. Jonathan, I'll be curious to hear in your marital ministry, you know, the creative ways that you guys have been able to serve your communities there. And we'll make sure to discuss that when we get back. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook. It's Point of View Radio on Facebook. You can be watching live, and then pointofview.net. We'll have all the articles we've talked about already. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about those, you can go there. And of course, you can call in on the line 800-351-1212. 800-351-1212. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll be back after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hi, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I am your host, Chelsey Youman, and I've got with me on the line Jonathan Teague, who is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. We are talking all things millennial, but we're switching gears here a little bit, and we're going to be talking about some interesting ways that we have to hope and be excited and grateful to serve one another, even in the midst of the crisis we're in. So thank you for being with us, Jonathan.
You bet, Chelsey.
Well, I also, in addition to my moonlighting here at Point of View, work as the Texas State Director for Human Coalition Action, and we're the advocacy arm to the largest pro-life organization in the country, dedicated to serving women and empowering women so that they choose life ultimately at the end of the day. And the work we do, I mean, we are nationwide. We were previously, about 2 months ago, 45 clinics across the country serving women. And then I advocate for their rights and take all the wealth of knowledge and information that I have at my fingertips for who our clients are and what their tangible needs are, these women, why they're choosing or pursuing abortion. We take that information and the things that ultimately help them choose life and transform that into meaningful policy reform here in the state of Texas, and really advocate for those women so that we can expand what we call the National Rescue System, which is the rescue system for preborn children, and understanding that we can affect the supply side of the equation for the abortion industry, and decrease abortions, obviously, through policy work. But we really need to work also with the women on the demand side of the equation and really meet them where they're at, and serve them. And so I have an article that you guys can look up at pointofview.net, from our website that our president, Brian Fisher, wrote. And it's about really how this pandemic has impacted what we're seeing in the pro-life movement, and in the abortion side of the equation as well. And I know that a few weeks ago, Jonathan, we talked about how uncertainty and economic crisis drives abortion rates up, because a lot of women, the majority of women seeking an abortion are not necessarily who you think of when you think of an abortion-determined woman. She already has a child. She is in her mid-20s typically is a lower income and already trying to figure out how to feed the mouths that she has in her household. And so when she comes and calls our client centers, she's really in a desperate situation. Sometimes there's domestic violence involved. Sometimes it's uncertain living situations. If she's working an hourly job, how can she pay for childcare for another child in addition to the one she already has? So they're very real, tangible issues that she has to get past, kind of that crisis mindset and the stress factors in order to see like the goodness of life, and of choosing life. And our clinics work so hard to help get her there and work through that. So one thing that's been interesting about obviously this pandemic is uncertainty is on the rise for everybody economically. And with that has come a vast increase in the demand for abortion services. And while that sounds really negative, a lot of pregnancy resource centers have closed their doors and view themselves as non-essential. But we know, especially here in the state of Texas, thanks to our governor and Attorney General Paxton for defending it, that abortion clinics are pretty much closed because as non-essential, there's not real health care. The Fifth Circuit has held on to that, which we are obviously very excited about and supportive of. But just to give our audience an update on some of the statistics from Human Coalition, in March, we switched over the weekend from our brick and mortar clinics to an entirely virtual model. I mean, it didn't take much to see the writing on the wall and say, we've got to get women into our call centers next because we won't be able to see them through our doors. And so over the weekend, we did that. And since then, we've had to increase our service provider hours by 200 a week. We've increased our hours from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. because of the increase in clients walking through, or I say walking through, calling us. There's been a 51% increase in clients per week including a 94% increase in clients in crisis compared to the prior weeks, 3 weeks before that. So we are seeing the opportunity to serve thousands and thousands of women, and their life choices are affirming in that. They are choosing life ultimately. It's really an opportunity for us to just meet their tangible needs. Everything from one of our clients went to 3 separate stores and could not find wipes for the baby she does have. And one of, our clinic workers was able to find wipes and drop them off for her at her front door. Everything from those what seem like small but tangible acts of kindness to helping women switch. One of our staff handled questions about the virus. There's misinformation out there that the children can get it in utero, and none of that's true. The truth is that children are not statistically getting it in utero. I'm pregnant and my doctor is not worried about me at all. I'm due in 2.5 weeks and we're still going strong. There's a lot of information that we're helping perpetuate the truth on the medical side of this virus. And one of our clinic directors said that a woman switched from scared to excited for her child. And so that's some hope and silver lining. And Jonathan, I don't know if you want to add to that. We've got a couple minutes left before the end of the hour, but I just wanted to leave on a hopeful note that there's reason to hope, because there are so many women that are coming out of the woodwork that we're able to reach now that we were not before.
Oh, you bet. Yeah. And I want to applaud all the work you're doing, Chelsey, and your organization. And in so many ways, what you just described is why being in Texas, and I think Texas is leading the way overall in many ways. And certainly the conservative and pro-life movement in Texas is leading the way. I think maybe, and you would be better versed in this than I, but maybe opening the door to some interesting legal precedent change, and that would open the door for us for larger implications down the road, and finally and fully defeating Roe v. Wade. But I know in our church right now, our pregnancy center, it's one of the best and most amazing things we do. And I know one thing our members have been doing, I'll just do this really quickly, Chelsey, is we've been asking our members to drop off diapers and other just things and supplies that these unbelievable moms who are, engaging in our pregnancy center and then choosing life. We've talked about this before. We don't want to just leave those moms and those babies there. We want to continue to partner with them, walk with them, encourage them, and love them. And especially now, like you said, with the economic realities, right? I mean, if everything we just got done saying is true for young adults and millennials and these maybe younger moms making those choices, they're walking into a world of great unpredictability. Mm-hmm. And so we've just decided as a church, you know what, we're not okay with the idea of a mom who chooses life and a precious baby to be born. We're not okay with the idea of that little baby not having diapers or other things that it may need in the first months or year of its life. We're gonna say as a church and as Christians, man, we can press into that and we can be a part of the longer term blessing and solution and outcome of choosing life. So it's sort of that whole, pro-life beyond just having that beautiful baby, but continue to partner and love those families well. So it's just one example where our church is really trying to step up, and there'll be more opportunities, as you know, in the days ahead for us to be incredibly proactive. And right, that goes back to that opportunity moment, right? There's all sorts of needs that are going to be emerging right now. And I think people's hearts, Chelsey, maybe more than ever, are going to be open to being loved and being served. And maybe some of that non-affinity, right? The spiritual nuns out there where I'm backing out of religion. Maybe right now their hearts are so open in ways like never before, where we could meet people at their point of need, and with it also bringing the gospel. That would be an unbelievable blessing.
I think that's just such a great point. And we're so grateful for the work that churches are doing to serve not just their members, but communities around them during this time. And it's certainly a time of opportunity, as you mentioned. Well, when we get back from our break that we're about to take, we're going to have with us on the line Richard Lim out of Washington, D.C., and Shane Pruitt with the National North American Mission Board to discuss a lot more topics and current events from a millennial perspective right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on Point of View today. We have the Millennial Roundtable lined up for you guys, where you're going to get to hear about all kinds of current events from millennial perspectives. I'm so excited about not just the guests, but the topics we have lined up for today. I'm your host, Chelsey Youman. Thank you for joining us. Today we've got Jonathan Teague. He's on the line, and he is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. He's always got such a fresh perspective and great perspective on anything we discuss. So thank you for joining us today, Jonathan.
It's great to be with you, Chelsey.
We also have joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. is Richard Lim. He is currently the host of This American President podcast, which I encourage our entire audience, go to your podcast right now and add This American Presidents, because he has so much historical facts, everything about current events. He looks at through the frame of history and brings so much enlightenment on that. So thank you for joining us, Richard. We're really glad to have you today.
Great to be here, and I hope no one holds the fact that I'm in D.C. right now against me.
I don't think they will. We have a great show lined up for you guys today. We'll be talking a little bit later in the show. We'll touch, of course, the coronavirus news is never ending. So we will be touching on that, how China has spread disinformation about the virus, and really what implications not only has that had for us as America, but really what should we do about that, and how should we be thinking internationally about those issues. We'll also talk a little bit about how the Dems have used this coronavirus crisis as an opportunity to really push for policies and initiatives wholesale that they have always really wanted, but haven't been able to get through traditional routes like government, legislature, normal governing times. So we'll talk about voting by mail and some of those other broader issues with Richard as well in the last half hour. But we'll start actually switching gears here. I do want to talk about Vice President Biden, former Vice President Biden will be choosing his own vice president here in the next few months. There's been a lot of speculation about this, but this is just something that I think we should be paying attention to and looking at, because after all, there are still national elections occurring in November. I know in the state of Texas, we have deferred our runoff elections until at least June. But November is still on the horizon. And although we have, of course, so many things to be thinking about and worrying about in society, let's not forget that democracy is still up and running. And so we will have candidates to choose between. And I wanted to just highlight here during this segment with Richard and Jonathan on the line, Biden's going to be choosing his running mate. And where do we go from here? You can find all of our articles on pointofview.net, or you can follow us on Point of View Radio on Facebook and even watch us live there. So feel free to do that. Richard, you sent us a great article, which is also posted on pointofview.net, about Stacey Abrams signaling, essentially vying for presidential candidate Biden to pick her as a woman of color, and said that he's obligated to pick a woman of color. We know he has committed publicly to picking a woman candidate to run on his ticket, which obviously narrows the field for speculative purposes. But she specifically has really come out of the woodwork, saying, women of color are the huge backbone and the base of the Democrat Party. Obviously very very, I would say, traditionally and consistently with the Democrat, and it would be a way for him to essentially signal his own personal views on the importance of diversity in his party and bridge that gap a little bit from the typical white male ticket that we know Democrats are pretty much against in the public eye. So, Richard, have you thought much about this?
Yes, it's funny. I have a friend who is a Democrat, and
just one.
He's one of my favorite. I know. I guess
I have
he's
a
one
friend.
of my right. A friend. You need one. But anyways, he's one of my favorite Democrats because he's someone that will actually admit when their party does something dumb, which happens a lot. But anyways, basically, I sent him the article, and he said something to the effect of, that's tokenism, and it's terrible. And it's really unfortunate because you have really a candidate who, a potential candidate in Stacey Abrams that I think it's obvious she's trying to make a power play and show Biden essentially, look, kind of strong-arm him into choosing a woman of color. And, I happen to be a woman of color. And so it's one of those situations. And, this isn't the first time Biden's faced this because, when he was criticized by Senator Kamala Harris for opposing busing, which was one of those classic government top-down solutions to enforce social outcomes, which didn't work well at all, basically saying that he was in league with racists and doing this, and the only way he could have racial absolution is to choose a woman of color. So this is really just par for the course for the Democratic Party.
Jonathan, I know that we made sure that you got that article about him choosing his running mate. We know,
Sure.
again, he's already committed to choosing a woman publicly, but what are your thoughts on how he should go about this decision, or even the fact that Stacey Abrams is vying openly on The View for the position?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. It's been such a fascinating, and I would defer to Richard certainly from an expertise level, but it just as an observer, it's just been so fascinating to see how the Democratic journey towards their candidate has vacillated, and just the spectrum of people that have presented themselves in that process. And then, sure enough, as inevitabilities always seem to reign in the political sphere, you end up with Joe Biden. And I don't mean this rudely at all, but I mean him saying, we're going to only look at a woman for vice president might be one of the most coherent things he said in a few months. And I really don't mean that rude. It's just there's been such a whirlwind of confusion surrounding the process in general, and then just on top of that, I mean, how would you like to be Joe Biden today? And you can't. I know, insert joke there, I guess, but I mean, how you can't really campaign the way you want. You really can't. So he's got to say something, right? I mean, something substantive has got to come out of that narrative to stay competitive at this point, because President Trump, like it or not, depending on where you fall on which corner of the issue, he's got the mic every day. And so his electability, if you will, or re-electability, is on display every day for the public. And he gets sort of a first-round refusal to be able to keep his narrative out there in full force. And so, I mean, that's part of incumbency, right? And so President Trump has that, just like President Obama did, President Bush, et cetera. And so, if you're in Joe Biden's team today, I would imagine that, you've got to make, this is going to be arguably one of the most, maybe the most important decision he makes, because both of his age and all of the things that seem to be swirling around just his persona. And, this is a big decision for him. And so it's going to be interesting to watch it unfold.
It is. And timing's going to be everything. I know that he's appointed a committee and is set to release all of that really in June is what he said, maybe July. So we look for him. His timing's going to be important because, as you mentioned, he'll need the stage again. He'll need an audience, after all, in order to campaign. We've got to go to one of those mandatory breaks, but when we get back, we will continue to talk about candidate Biden's vice presidential pick. And don't forget to go to our website, pointofview.net, pointofview.net. We'll see you soon.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
How many Americans have died of the coronavirus? You might think the answer to that question would be fairly simple. After all, we have the bodies in morgues and funeral homes that we can count. That is true, but how many of those people died of the virus becomes a more difficult question to answer. Most media reports argue that we have had a significant undercount, even in this country. It isn't because government officials are trying to hide anything. It is due to the widespread lack of testing, especially in the early weeks of the outbreak. Also, people dying at home aren't usually tested, and even some who die at a hospital or a nursing home may not be tested because the medical examiners are overburdened in many of the nation's hotspots. In order to counter this disparity, New York City last week decided to add 3,700 people to its death tolls. They presumed they died of the virus. That addition increased the U.S. death toll by 17%. And it's worth mentioning that Ohio also had included people in the death toll whom they suspected of having the virus. But is it possible that instead of an undercount, we might have an overcount? Dr. Anthony Fauci has dismissed this concern as merely a conspiracy theory, but Dr. Deborah Birx explained in a recent press briefing that people are counted as victims of the pandemic if they tested positive for the coronavirus, even if something else caused their death. This raises an important distinction between dying from the virus versus dying with the virus. And I'm not just playing with prepositions. If you died of cancer or a heart attack, but also tested positive for COVID-19, you are listed as a victim of the pandemic. As you can see, getting an accurate number of the coronavirus deaths isn't so easy. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hi, welcome back from the break. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today, and I've got on the line Richard Lim, and he is helping us talk about candidate Biden's vice presidential pick and how we should really be thinking through that. We've also got Jonathan Teague on the line, who's the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. And joining us in studio is Shane Pruitt, and he's with the National North American Mission Board. So full table of millennial perspectives, no shortage of opinions, I'm sure, for our audience today. But Richard, I did want to kick it back to you. We're talking about how much Stacey Abrams has been openly vying for the vice presidential position on the Democrat ticket. And also we've been talking about just how Biden has already committed to choosing a woman for diversity's sake on the ticket. I have a couple things I wanted to start with, which is there are traditionally a few goals, obviously, that the presidential candidate has for selecting their vice president. And some of these, are more priority setting than others. They typically have panels helping them decide. But 538 had a great article that said, the first goal that might or might not be substantiated in history is that it will help with electability. The second goal is typically to balance the ticket demographically, particularly relating to race and ethnicity, which it appears this is Biden's, primary interest at this point. And then balancing the ticket ideologically is another goal that is typically taken into mind and consideration when a presidential candidate is choosing a vice president. And that can be, we know that Biden is more centered on the ticket. So he has the opportunity to choose someone who's far more left, far more radical on their views in an effort to really motivate his base, mobilize his base, and excite them. Although that, again, has not historically been proven. We don't have that many tests historically. I think there's been only 28 races since like World War II to really do this analysis of. But in general, that these are some of the trains of thoughts that these panels will be deciding. And then finally, helping Democrats keep their Senate majority is something that he strategically has to keep in mind. If he chooses a Democrat senator, such as Ellen Warren or any of those, then they're looking at having special elections or waiting and maybe losing seats for incumbent Democrats. So Democrats have to be mindful that they want to probably keep those Democrat seats, and incumbents traditionally win 90% of the time throughout elections. So those are a little bit some of the considerations that we know are in mind. Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Jonathan mentioned that this is probably the most important choice Biden will make, or at least thus far will have made. And I really agree with that, because historically, whenever a vice president is chosen, a nominee is chosen, that vice president usually gets elevated at a level above, national level above his or her peers. And they automatically become a national figure that really has implications for the history of the country going forward. When Eisenhower had Nixon, put on the ticket, that was a whole process. A lot of people were involved in that. But when Nixon got on the ticket, he was 38 years old. He was one of 100 senators in Congress, but then that made Nixon the future of the Republican Party. When Reagan chose Bush Sr., Bush Sr. had lost the race to Reagan in the primaries in 1980. When Reagan chose him, that put him on the path to the presidency, and we didn't know at the time, but eventually his son on the path to the presidency as well. So these decisions really have incredible implications down the line. Not always. I mean, sometimes they're just one-off candidates that you never hear of again. But, oftentimes it's a great responsibility, because they really, put someone in a position of national prominence that has implications for all of us. And one thing that's interesting to think of, too, is that about a year ago, or I guess in the past year, you've heard kind of whispers, allusions to the possibility that Joe Biden might just serve one term as president, given his age, given the fact that he's not the most exciting person. And we don't know if that's going to happen. If that does happen, he might kind of quietly say he'll do it without announcing it. We don't know. But if that's the case, then whoever's chosen as vice president becomes heir presumptive for that nomination. And so that's something that's going to have to be looked at carefully. There are a lot of names listed right now. You mentioned the different factors, whether it's balancing the ticket demographically, ideologically, and making up for the perceived, weaknesses of Joe Biden. And I think my hunch is that it's going to be something kind of a reverse of what John McCain did in 2008. John McCain didn't really have the trust of the base of the party. He was a moderate, and there wasn't a lot of excitement around him. Democrats were thrilled about Obama. Republicans weren't thrilled about McCain. So he needed someone to jazz up the base while also balancing him ideologically, getting someone perceived as more conservative. He chose Sarah Palin. I'm not saying that, there's a Sarah Palin person out there. But what I'm saying is that he might look to somebody ideologically, because right now enthusiasm for Biden is very low, whether it's among the base of the party, or especially among the coastal elites, especially among the liberals and the left. And so does he choose somebody farther to the left? I don't know if that's Kamala. She hasn't shown a great ability to get votes. It's really a fair game, but it's something to think about. And I think it's very important that we talk about this, because it's one of those decisions that at the time you just kind of wait for. But I really hope the media holds him accountable for who he chooses, because that person will be elevated to a position of importance and future responsibility.
Right. And, one thing we haven't talked about in addition is just kind of geographically where one thing we do statistically know from a political science perspective is tried and true fact is that it will give him a boost percentage-wise in the state that the vice presidential candidate is going to be from. And so he needs to be also thinking in terms of geography, because it's pretty much a given that he's going to take California. He's going to take New York. I mean, we've got some of these more liberal, extreme sides of the country, but he's weak in the Midwest. And those are the states that President Trump surprised everybody in the last go around. Michigan, Wisconsin. I mean, those states with your blue collar workers, or just your average Americans, I would say, who aren't really on one side of the extreme or the other when it comes to the parties, but they're, a lot more moderate thinking and independent thinking. He's got to think in terms of keeping those voters from the base as well. Shane, I know that you've just joined us recently. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add before we go to a break in a couple minutes?
Yeah, really interesting. I think this point was already made by Richard, but I think with Stacey Abrams saying that is like, he really needs a woman of color. Look, I'm a woman of color, mm-hmm. And then, in a Monday interview, what was very interesting, in a Monday interview that Biden did with a Pittsburgh TV station, Michelle Obama's name came up, and he said, I'd take her in a heartbeat, was the exact words, And so you almost wonder if that's not out there being mm-hmm. considered. And the irony of that's being spoken of when it really just took, up till last week for former President Obama to even endorse Biden publicly. Yeah.
That's just a little bit delayed,
Once everyone else did, and now I'll throw in my endorsement.
Yeah, what about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think Shane makes a great point, Richard as well. I mean, I saw that too. I saw another article, Shane, that popped up that someone had postulated out there, Chelsey, what a Michelle Obama vice presidency could mean is like a reverse turn back to another, 12 years of an Obama White House. And I mean, wouldn't that kind of be a full circle kind of deal? Who knows if she would do it, if they would do it. Man, the electability flips overnight if that were the case. Talk about millennials and their response. I mean, I think that would change, Richard, I think that would change the electoral map potentially for sure. Mm-hmm. Whether they would do it, does Biden have the gravitas to carry that ticket with them behind as opposed to vice versa? That's the real question. I do think the reality of a one-term presidency for Biden, that's not out of the realm of possibility, not only because of his age, but because of all these other factors you guys have described. So it could get really interesting here in a few months.
It certainly could. Well, I'm so grateful for you guys and your thoughts on this, because it is a very big decision on the horizon for our country and our audience out there to be aware of. And in a world where we get a lot of news on one topic right now, I think it's just so important to highlight maybe some other facets of society that we really should be paying attention to. So we're anticipating that decision to be coming out in the next few months. We've got to go to one of those breaks now, but you can always go to pointofview.net and read up more on these articles and our outstanding other panelists we have today. I'm so grateful they're with us. And when we get back, we'll continue talking about this, but also we might be switching to vote by mail and some of the broader initiatives we're seeing the Democrats use this crisis to push right now, some initiatives they've wanted for years and decades even, right after the break when we get back. So stay with us.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host for Point of View. We've got the Millennial Roundtable today, and there's no shortage of news, topics, or opinions on our table. So I thank you for joining us. We've got Richard Lim out of D.C., and he has a lot of things that he works on, but This American President is his podcast. So I would encourage all of you to go to your podcast app right now and look up This American President. download, listen. He's got my favorite one recently that I listened to was his podcast on pandemics, presidents, and prophets. With really insightful, just historical information that is always going to be relevant to look at current events through a historical lens and really just to know where we've come from. So we've got Richard here. Shane Pruitt is in studio. He's with the National North American Mission Board doing great work with generations younger than millennials. Believe it or not, we're not the only ones who should be continuing to take heat right now. There are younger generations we can harp on, but also on the line, we've got Jonathan Teague, and he works with, he's a minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church in the DFW area, doing great work there. So I thank you guys for being with us today. We have talked a lot about President candidate Biden's vice presidential pick. He's committed to it being a woman, and Stacey Abrams says that it should be a woman of color. She happens to be a woman of color and is pretty openly vying for the seat. So we noted that and kind of analyzed it already. If you guys want to go back and listen to that. But next, we're going to be talking about voting by mail in this election, which it's so important that we continue to, as a society, pay attention to. We do have not just a national election, but local elections. In the state of Texas, our runoffs have been pushed back a month, but at the end of the day, November is still approaching, and it's our very democracy is obviously at stake. That's something we're all so passionate about here. Is the integrity of that democracy, and elections are pivotal to that. The Constitution speaks to that. But we have seen a broader push, and even in the state of Texas, there's a lawsuit going on by the Democrat Party for mail-in ballots and voting by mail, which obviously would not require an ID. And in my opinion, it's rife for voter fraud. We've seen it done in other states. 36 states currently have laws requiring voter IDs, and that's for very good reasons. You can't even get a cell phone without a voter ID. But in a world where everything goes online and everybody cares about convenience, and right now coronavirus is a crisis, making in-person interaction difficult or dangerous in some circumstances, Democrats are now taking this as an opportunity to really capitalize and push on something they've wanted for decades, which is no voter IDs when it comes to voting and mail-in ballots remotely. And the issue with that, from my perspective, is there's many issues, but we talked about voter fraud I mentioned that being one of them. Even in one of the cities around here in Fort Worth, there was prosecution a few years ago for residential homes are allowed, when elderly patients have a disability, they're allowed to mail in their votes and ballots. Those were stolen and reworked and then sent in, and those people were prosecuted. But we have to remember that without a voter ID, there's no way to verify who's voting, if it's under duress, if the ballots have been tampered with. There are just so many issues when it comes to voter fraud and mail-in ballots. So, Richard, do you have anything to add about your thoughts on remote voting, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly a play for ensuring that basically as much fraud as possible can happen. So, I think it's very obvious, and that's something demographically that they've been trying to secure for some time, which is why in many states you're seeing people with questionable legal status being, discussed as being able to vote. And so, yeah, unfortunately, this is something that's not new, and it's one of those things. We're talking about opportunistic type of actions here, and whether it's during a pandemic and the Democrats are trying to use this as a excuse to expand the size of government, or in terms of voting, which is something that they've done for some time. It's really it's the same stuff.
Mm-hmm. And one additional issue is just the opportunity that people would have to vote. I think I heard that in Wisconsin they had to do a recall a few years back for the governor voting because they did a full recount because more dead people showed up to vote in that election than any other election in history. And so these are very tangible concerns that I want to highlight because I think that they really go to the core of elections and our very democracy, just in protecting the integrity of that system. Jonathan, I know that you're on the line. Have you thought much about remote voting and all the things the Democrats are pushing for right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, Chelsey, because I think, as has already been said, one of the major issues, and Attorney General Paxton in that article that you shared with us, I think kind of directly, I kind of met this head on, this whole idea of fraudulent voting and what the state's role, the county's role, the local system's role is in perpetuating or facilitating fraud intentionally or unintentionally. Obviously, we want our elections to be fair. We want them to be accessible. I mean, here's the reality. If you haven't been sick and you've been going to the grocery store, chances are you can probably go stand in line and vote. And if in some level, and I mean, I was just reading the statute again that it was quoting that article. I mean, basically, absentee balloting by and large has always been a fail-safe parallel lane for voting to ensure that you've got a chance as a citizen to, lend your voice and be represented. If in some way you just physically can't show up to vote. But I do think that this cuts right to the core of how sacred it is to be able to have a vote in this country and anywhere that values a democratic process. And so I think once we start to move the dial, or maybe a better expression would be once we start to move the goalpost on the threshold of what we're okay with, the problem with that is it opens up 100 new implications that, to Richard's point, the motives have not always been super pure on that. Because it's usually not just about someone being able to vote, right? Mm-hmm. It's about expanding that whole idea of changing a process or altering a system in such a way where, maybe even bias comes into play, and certainly, of course, like you said, theft and fraud and all these other things. And it's something I think we've got to be so slow and cautious and careful about. I think a rush to it only hurts the fidelity of the process overall in the short run and the long run.
That's right. I mean, Shane, I'm always saying that at the root, and I explain this to my parents because sometimes my parents will just say, like, why do the Democrats respond the way they do to things? Like, why is everything always a complete revolutionary overhaul? It's never just these like incremental changes that we should make to our system. And I think at the core of that, and the National Review Institute has a great resources on this, is that at the core of their party, one of the main philosophies is that revolution is the way to produce change. It's the primary and only way. And so everything is from the beginning of their history as a party has been, we have to revolutionize. We have to remove the institutions and change them completely in order to fix them. And so for me, I think incrementalism is important. They should be measured. We should have an understanding, a database to understand where we're going and why. Shane, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a little humorous to me. And, because the narrative that we've heard since 2016 was the election was hijacked, right? Mm-hmm. And so, what we should do is we should relax the standards of voting, right?
Yeah.
That sounds really intelligent, Yeah, I've been thinking through this, wrestling through this, and I'll just be honest. I think my first mind went, well, everything I do is online now. I pay my bills online. I can do car insurance online. I can give it to my church online. Mm-hmm. But the more I thought about it is if I'm hacked, it just affects me. If an election is hacked, it affects a whole city or a whole state or a whole nation. I think just the implications of it are so much greater. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
No, that's all I was going to say.
Yes, it's just that when you think about the implications and how highly motivated we saw in the last election, the tampering was not just from Americans voting, and on behalf of dead people that they found their voter IDs, but by international entities who have it out for us. I mean, Russia and China are threats that are to be reckoned with, and we can talk about that a little bit later in this show. But they're forces to be reckoned with that I think we've fallen asleep at the wheel on, especially my generation. We have not viewed them as viable threats because we didn't live through the Cold War. Mm-hmm. We don't remember what it's like necessarily. Yeah. So we have to go to one of those. breaks, but we will be back right after this. And when we do get back, I'm going to hit it over to Richard, because I do want to hear his broader views on what he's seeing the Democrats push for on the business side of things, and historically what we've seen Democrats push for in ways that have not been able to be clawed back, even in decades. So when we get back, just listen for those issues, because we've got lots of topics to continue to cover.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, hi, I'm Chelsey Youman, and I'm back from the break with Jonathan Teague. We've got Shane Pruitt and also Richard Lim on the line. We have had no shortage of issues to talk about, but right now we've been talking about this real push we've seen by Democrats, and even in the state of Texas, the Democratic Party sued the state of Texas for vote by mail, remote voting, and relaxing those tried and true voter identification rules. But really, we're seeing this sentiment more broadly across the country than just relating to the issue of voting by mail and remote ballot voting. We're seeing a push for bigger loans going to small businesses, bigger government, really everything they've wanted, more money going to abortion, everything that the Democrats have wanted. They're really capitalizing on this crisis as an opportunity in a lot of ways to push their issues forward. So, Richard, I wanted to kick it over to you, and with your not just your historical perspective, but your political knowledge, get your thoughts on that and what trends you're seeing, and what you think about those trends.
Absolutely. And this is something that has happened in the Democratic Party time and time again. Everyone knows that FDR used the Great Depression as a pretext to push through progressive legislation. But they also forget that Lyndon Johnson did the same thing, but this time it was with the Kennedy assassination. Johnson became president after Kennedy was killed, and the nation was devastated. They were mourning, and Johnson basically said, look, vote for me because we have to pass all these things in the name of John F. Kennedy. So basically, if you oppose, all these the Great Society, if you oppose food stamps, if you oppose Medicare and Medicaid, you hate John F. Kennedy, right? And who's going to want to say you hate John F. Kennedy right after the guy was killed? And that's what they did. That was 50 plus years ago. And so we just have to assume that that's what the Democrats are going to do all the time. They're using this crisis as an excuse to push through the universal basic income because they want to manage the economy. And the thing is that it's very important, I think, for us to know that the data is on our side as far as arguments go. I was doing research on a podcast episode, and I was looking into a study on wealth inequality. And there was a study from Berkeley in 2003. So when I say Berkeley, I'm saying that obviously this is not a conservative institution. And yet this study was done by one of the great wealth inequality experts in the world, Thomas Piketty. And it basically said that wealth inequality did not, wealth distribution did not get more equal as a result of the Great Society at all. In fact, wealth got more equal starting in 1983. The poorest levels started getting richer in 1983, 2 years after the Reagan tax cuts. As conservatives, we need to know that the history and the data is on our side. The history shows that the Democrats try to hijack the democratic process and shove these programs that don't work. The data shows that our solutions work and theirs don't. I think we need to embrace that as a movement. And we need to know about those things, and we need to express those things, say these things, because we have to have all hands on deck to fight these kind of things.
You're so right. They say that a page of history is worth a volume of logic, and so understanding where we've come from, I think, is so important. And even as millennials, I don't know that we as quickly through our education can recall all of this history and events. And so it's so important just to highlight that for those of us who didn't live through it, and for those who even did but haven't necessarily taken the time from a long-term standpoint to look at the implications of some of that or know the data. That's so important. I mean, Jonathan, did you know all of that, or what are your thoughts on what Richard had to say?
No, I mean, that's fascinating to think about. And again, I just think, as we talked earlier, Chelsey, these implications of what we're living through right now, of all of the different factors and what this particular season we're going through as a nation, how it's going to impact every generation, but young adults in particular. And I mean, I think, I don't think I think the historical irony abounds here. And again, I would defer to Richard's expertise, but just as a novice reader and somebody who loves history, the ironies abound here that all of this would be taking place in an election year, particularly a presidential election year, and a president like President Trump, and a second term opportunity, and all these different things. And I just think it's been fascinating. I mean, wasn't it yesterday that he was just impeached? I'm trying to remember. I mean, it's just. I mean, what we've seen politically, socially, economically in these last 5 or 6 months, I mean, it's just been jam-packed with really monumental moments. And I'm really, really curious to see, I know for Shane and I in more of the spiritual space, just to see, again, just the ripple effect of how people will view each other, the realities of, again, Chelsey, just going back to the idea of trusting people and trusting process and institutions. Those have already plummeted like a rock for young adults. I mean, so the idea of whether it's voter fidelity or what our government's doing or best intentions and policies and all that, man, the idea that there's just this snap your fingers credibility for the people that are making and writing our laws beyond just the political agendizing that I think Richard's so right to point out historically. Now I think we're going to see the manifestation of all those realities. And then this idea that will this next wave of political leaders in particular, to what degree are they willing to to sacrificially lead. And we talked about that earlier, Chelsey, that idea of maybe this is a leadership moment coming for the next generation of leaders on every level of our culture. And maybe just a call to some sacrificial. I mean, think about Kennedy, you know, one of the things you can't argue with John Kennedy is he was not afraid to sort of lay out that national sacrificial narrative. And to what degree that was true or untrue in his own personal life, certainly in his political life. I mean, he took some great risks. And so, you know, what risks are we going to take to maybe rebuild national trust and maybe rebuild some real, actual national unity through these processes? And gosh, wouldn't it be great to lay some of these tertiary and secondary political agendas aside? I know that sounds really idealistic, but man, that'd be fascinating to see if some of this would force our hand in that way.
Right. We certainly have a lot of rebuilding to do as a society. We have just a quick moment left. Shane, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think just even in light of this, and Jonathan started alluding to it, is just in the middle of this crisis and pandemic, it's really sad when you see some politicians, some media outlets, it's almost like they're more passionate about the White House failing right now than they are as America succeeding. And I've heard a lot of young leaders say, right now I am making a list of politicians who are making this a political opportunity, and that's exactly who I'm going to be voting against in this time. So I think this is a defining moment for politicians, leaders.
It certainly is. Well, we've got to go to our break at the end of the hour. We'll, of course, be back after this. But Richard Lim, I wanted to say thank you for joining our show the last hour and give you the opportunity to just tell us a little bit about you and your podcast and where our listeners can find it at.
Thank you. It was great chatting with all of you. We are at thisamericanpresident.com, and we're on iTunes and Spotify and all the usual, outlets.
Great. Again, This American President, and Richard Lim does a great job just looking at history and letting us know where we came from. And it's so important to know those things. One of his most recent ones I loved was the Pandemics, Presidents, and Prophets one. It talks about how previous presidents have handled crisis like the ones we're in. So thank you for joining us, Richard. When we get back, we've got a lot more to discuss. We're going to be talking about China spreading disinformation and millennials during their second biggest economic crisis in our very short adult lives, frankly. When we get back, we'll stay tuned because Jonathan Teague will stay with us and Shane Pruitt will be with us as well. So thank you for joining us. Go to our website at pointofview.net. You can see all the articles we've talked about and more, hear more about these great panelists we've had today, or you can follow us at Facebook, pointofview.radio on Facebook. You can listen live there as well. So stay tuned. We'll be back right after this short break.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view I think is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, hello, I'm Chelsey Youman, and I am your host today for Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. We've got some great millennial panelists around the table today joining us for the show, so I'm very excited. We've got lots of great things to cover. Shane Pruitt is with us. He is with the National North American Mission Board. Shane, thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Doing well. It's an honor to be on. You're doing such a great job leading this show.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
We're keep practicing our social distancing here. And then Jonathan Teague, he's also with us on the phone. He is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, Chelsey. It's great to be with you guys.
We have no shortage of things to talk about today. If I'm out of breath, it is not because I've been working out. It is because I am due with my third child in 2.5 weeks. So just bear with me. No working out over here, but I am always out of breath. So we are moving and grooving today. We've talked about everything from former Vice President Biden's vice presidential pick, which should be coming up shortly, to voting by mail and the push by the Democrats for a lot of the initiatives they've really wanted for decades and using this crisis as a way to do that. But we're going to turn this next hour and talk about really three big things. First, that China's spreading disinformation about the virus immediately after it really picked up steam here in the U.S. We'll also be talking about millennials. Our article is Millennials Don't Stand a Chance. It was posted by the Atlantic earlier this month and really talks about how this is the second great recession that we have seen in our very short adult lifetime, and really the implications on our generation that's had, but also, talking about other generations and how all that works together. And then we'll just end with talking about the churches reopening across the country, and our ministries reopening, and really what this might mean in a broader sense for society. So stay tuned for all of those issues and more. We would also love to hear from you if you're excited or have any comments or point of views you do want to share with us about anything we discussed today. You can always call in at 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. So let's get started. I want to start by talking about China, because I just love the opportunity to really shed light on how horrible they are and how much as a society we need to hold them accountable. Not because the virus started there. Viruses can start anywhere, as we all know, but because not only from the beginning has there been continual lies and hiding and disinformation internally in China to the rest of the world about this virus that could have really saved lives in our nation. But they continued those efforts after the virus had already spread to the United States. So specifically, The Hill published an article that said that our Pentagon officials have reported officially that China amplified disinformation about the coronavirus to spread fear. And the New York Times has also written about this. The White House National Security Council publicly confirmed that and denounced, obviously, rumors that were spread through devices. They used technology we weren't really aware that they were able to use to directly send text messages and articles to people's phones, similar, as you may remember, as Russia sent fake articles and information and news out there through social media platforms during the election cycle. Now China has done that, saying things preemptively before the country was issued more stay-at-home orders, that the country is going to close down, businesses are going to close down, there's going to be a recession, go to your grocery store and get goods and services. There were so many rumors being passed around, and that led to food shortages in our country, diaper shortages, toilet paper shortages we all are very aware of, but just a lot of fear mongering. And I really wanted to highlight this article mostly because I think my generation as millennial, we don't remember the Cold War. We didn't live through a lot of tangible international threats besides, obviously, it's radical Islamic terrorism, which is a huge international threat. But we have mostly not been exposed to the real tangible threat that Russia and China are as communist nations to our sovereignty as a country. They have historically tried, we know the last election, to threaten our democracy. And they do it in high-tech ways. They do it in novel ways that we should just be aware of. And so, Jonathan, you're on the line. I wanted to hear what your thoughts are when it comes to China continuing to spread disinformation and fear in an effort to cripple our economy.
Yeah, Chelsey, and I love, and I would echo what Shane said. You're doing a great job. It's always good to be with you guys. And I think, man, you kind of harken back to the Cold War narrative. This is so 80s, man. Since it's Millennial Roundtable, we can have some fun with this, Shane. But, the original Red Dawn cast, not the reboot from a few years ago that I'm not going to comment on, but the original Red Dawn cast, somebody posted something funny on social media the other day that, the class of 84, they missed their graduation too, and that movie was set right there in that time. And Russia invades and all this silly stuff. And it's kind of humorous, but it does draw you back to a time in the world, Chelsey, where, there was a real ideological juxtaposition between essentially, a republic democracy like ours, republicanism at its core, so, political philosophy, and Marxism, communism, socialism. And although that, we were talking earlier about the Democratic field of candidates, although the Democratic socialism language has been introduced in the American consciousness and American media, and is really, I think, one of the things I think we need to take real note of, Chelsey, is how just overnight, how normal it was for a candidate for the office of President of the United States to talk about the merits of democratic socialism, when the reality is democratic socialism is a synonym. It's coded language for Marxism. I mean, that's what it is. So, spoiler alert, if in fact it continues to be proven that to one degree or another, the Chinese government and the communist apparatus is spreading false information, it's like, spoiler alert, that's what Marxism does. To have state control, you have to essentially manipulate information. Mm-hmm. And so I just hope that maybe through this sort of rush to a more socialistic framework in our nation, where supposedly everybody gets the same thing of everything, which is, we know, because the reality of total depravity of our sin nature, is always impossible. That's never going to happen, because I want what you want, and I'll do more than you will to keep it and get it. So human nature just sort of runs against socialism's aims. So the idea that a Chinese government would try to infiltrate and attack the essence of who we are, rather than on the field of battle per se, which would be horrible, but boy, in the field of disinformation and misinformation, it just kind of adds up, right? And so I think that ought to be a cue to us that maybe democratic socialism should not be our future.
Just maybe a small cue, but yes, I think it's just important to highlight this. When we get back from our break, we are going to continue to talk about this briefly, and I'm curious to get Shane's thoughts on it as well. In addition, what does accountability look like? I mean, what do we do about what the information that we have and the issues that the Chinese government has created for us as a society? So those are important, big questions we'll make sure we get back to. You can always look up these articles or see what we're talking about more on pointofview.net. You can listen in on Point of View Radio on Facebook as well. We are live there. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, but we'll be back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
How many Americans have died of the coronavirus? You might think the answer to that question would be fairly simple. After all, we have the bodies in morgues and funeral homes that we can count. That is true, but how many of those people died of the virus becomes a more difficult question to answer. Most media reports argue that we have had a significant undercount, even in this country. It isn't because government officials are trying to hide anything. It is due to the widespread lack of testing, especially in the early weeks of the outbreak. Also, people dying at home aren't usually tested, and even some who die at a hospital or a nursing home may not be tested because the medical examiners are overburdened in many of the nation's hotspots. In order to counter this disparity, New York City last week decided to add 3,700 people to its death tolls. They presumed they died of the virus. That addition increased the U.S. death toll by 17%. And it's worth mentioning that Ohio also had included people in the death toll whom they suspected of having the virus. But is it possible that instead of an undercount, we might have an overcount? Dr. Anthony Fauci has dismissed this concern as merely a conspiracy theory, but Dr. Deborah Birx explained in a recent press briefing that people are counted as victims of the pandemic if they tested positive for the coronavirus, even if something else caused their death. This raises an important distinction between dying from the virus versus dying with the virus. And I'm not just playing with prepositions. If you died of cancer or a heart attack, but also tested positive for COVID-19, you are listed as a victim of the pandemic. As you can see, getting an accurate number of the coronavirus deaths isn't so easy. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host for this Millennial Roundtable today. I've got around the table with me Shane Pruitt, and then on the line, Jonathan Teague. We have been talking about what our national security officials have confirmed, which is the Chinese government, much like the Russian government, using technology to spread misinformation in the beginning of, maybe even now, but the coronavirus pandemic here in the United States, which led to mass panic, fear-mongering, shortages in your grocery stores, everything you guys know and are living real time right now. Chinese government spread disinformation on to help create this crisis, especially economically, and just really wanting to discuss something that we don't discuss much as millennials, which is the real threat that communism does pose to America, and that's a live and active threat that is important. So before we continue the conversation, I wanted to go to one of our callers, Sarah from North Carolina. Sarah, are you there on the line?
Yes, I am. Thank you for letting me talk.
Absolutely, Sarah. We love to hear from you. Do you have any point of views you'd like to share with us?
I do. I got a Apple phone for the first time a couple of months ago, and one of the things that pops up on my phone is a news program, which I don't go to very much, but occasionally I accidentally pop it up and I read some of it, and it's one more of our news medias that's very skewed. It's very anti-Republican and anti-Trump. Mm-hmm. And I have noticed when I go in social media platforms such as Facebook that there tend to be many people that feel like their news source is the news source to be trusted, and your news source, if it's different from theirs, is misleading you. And it's very difficult to try to have a discussion with people that feel very strongly that way, because they just feel like that you have been misled, and they won't listen to any type of reasoning sometime, which is very disturbing to me. Another thing, too, with the Apple phone, one reason I went with it was because I felt that I'd always heard that they were more secure, and I wanted to do more online with a phone and feel secure with it, but it is making me feel insecure with how much it's connected to my computer and how much this phone knows about me when I haven't myself put it in there. And I know the phones are primarily made in China, and so I've been thinking, how secure is this really? Mm-hmm. How secure really is an Apple computer? How much is China really connected with all of this? And how much observing and watching and monitoring is actually being done that we don't know about? And it may not be any, but it sure makes me wonder. And since you're talking about China and misleading and interference, I thought I would bring that up. Another thing, too, back at the very beginning of the coronavirus, there was a professor from one of our major universities that was accused of giving or selling to the Chinese information that was biological and secure and that he should not have done. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about what happened with that? Was that just false accusations, or do you know where that went?
Sure, Sarah. So thank you so much for your call today. I love your perspective. And certainly on the first note that you mentioned, just the technology that China does have and the availability and access, we're not even completely sure of. I know that our national security governing officials have said we weren't even aware that they could spread the information in some of the ways that they are. And so that's certainly something I'm sure they'll be looking into in the future. We know that no data is really safe, right? Once we sign up for these apps, give them our data, that's one thing. But data mining is something that China and Russia have both done. We saw Russia do that pretty rampantly in the last election. So it's just certainly something for us to be aware of as we're consuming information, to check the source, make sure it's right. It's one of the reasons I'm grateful for Point of View, because you can count on, everything said here, that it's from the best news sources we can have. So we're happy to share that. On the second note, when it comes to I think it's the Harvard professors that you're referring to, Sarah, discussing sharing information with China and being a part, they were actually charged for that. And there are ongoing lawsuits and cases for certain professors in the medical field, feeding the information they weren't supposed to China, but also not sharing the correct information with our government officials. And so certainly there are a lot of layers to this, but it is all on the surface, and all things that I think everybody should be aware of is that there's a lot of layers here when it comes to information. And I want to just switch gears to Shane, because to me this implicates maybe broader questions, which for me are, what does accountability look like now that health? I leave health decisions to the health professionals, but when it comes to national security and it comes to democracy, when it comes to our governing in our own society, I mean, that is the duty of our governing officials to really interact with. And I know that Senator Tom Cotton, for instance, has submitted a bill that would allow individuals in the United States to sue the Chinese government for money related to cost problems related to the coronavirus, but also life lost related to coronavirus. I believe Missouri has sued the Chinese government for certain aspects of the way they withheld information and vital antibiotics in a time where our country needed them. We're very, very interrelated with China when it comes to pharmaceuticals. And so, Shane, have you looked into any of that, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, a little bit on the phone. I tell you, and I'm a fan of my iPhone. I'm on it a lot, but man, it feels like it is always listening. Have you ever just had like a natural conversation with someone and then you get on Instagram and Facebook and all these ads pop up, And so today is the NFL draft. I mean, I'm excited about that. So talking about it, I get on Instagram and Facebook, and here comes up all these mock NFL drafts after talking about it, And then when you talk about, China, can we just be honest? They have hashtag fake news down to an art, don't they? I mean, they make our journalists look like amateurs when it comes to fake news. And we're talking about China and the political agenda as a country, not the Chinese people, obviously. And us being millennials and then working with the next generation is already millennials, and then especially Generation Z, you have to work hard for their trust. They almost assume what you're saying has an agenda behind it, that it is fake. And all this is doing is helping cause more barriers. And, if you think about it, if a business in the United States or even a church operated like China did over the last 2 months, they would be sued and have lawsuits against them. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's so true. Jonathan, I know you're on the line. We've got about a minute and a half before break, but I wanted to kick it over to you and ask what your thoughts are when it relates to China.
Well, Chelsey, I think Shane is spot on. And Shane, I was thinking the same thing, man. Like now more than ever, because of the irresponsibility of others, it creates sort of a tsunami effect of skepticism and doubt that applies to all of us that would attempt to try to handle truth and convey to people and win hearts and minds and be persuasive with the gospel, particularly for somebody like Shane and I, Chelsey. And I just think now more than ever, just the call to integrity and authenticity. That goes back to that leadership moment, Chelsey. I mean, look at the opportunity in front of us, where as a generation we could change the narrative in our time if we would just get excited about truth telling and honesty and vulnerability and authenticity and integrity. I mean, just how refreshing that would be, because I think Shane's right. All this does is strip away more and more and more of just the confidence that young people in particular, have that anybody in authority is actually telling the truth when they talk. And so it's an opportunity for us to meet that head on with truth and integrity.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. When we get back from our break, we're going to be talking about how millennials have been impacted now in our short adult lives by the second great recession already. So how that's going to impact us, what the statistics have to say about that, but also just more broadly how that relates to other generations. So I hope you stay tuned with us. Don't forget to go to pointofview.net, where you can read any of the articles, anything you want about us. We've got great resources up there. You can also go to Facebook and look for us. We're at Point of View Radio on Facebook. Don't forget to follow us, comment. We love to hear from you. And I hope you stick with us, because when we get back, we've got more to cover on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, and I am hosting the Millennial Roundtable today with a couple of great millennials. Today we're hearing from Jonathan Teague, who we've got on the line. He is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. And we've also got Shane Pruitt here in studio. He's with the National North American Mission Board. And before I get back with those guys, we have been talking about China and them using technology, sophisticated technology, the China's government, I should be more specific, to spread disinformation and panic in order to affect our economy, and that our national security advisors have confirmed that and are looking into that. So we've been discussing just really what does accountability look like with China in a time where I think 80% of our antibiotics come from China, and they withheld those in the middle of this crisis and pandemic. There's so many ways that our economy is really close with them, and we know our governing officials are finally starting to look into those ties. With Senator Cotton, he presented a bill forward I'm really grateful for, just to start to have accountability with China that says that American citizens can actually sue China for issues they've had with the coronavirus, both economically and for deaths related, because China hid for time and time again important information, life-saving information from us. And we've got a caller on the line. His name is Steve, and he's from Maine, and he wants to include his point of view on this. So thank you for calling in, Steve. Are you still on the line?
Yes, thank you. I just find this topic really interesting. Of course, I remember when NAFTA was started. I've been against that trade with China since its inception, and I'm wondering why on earth, how it could have happened so quickly, and why on earth we've continued it, and why it's fought so much. I mean, President Trump is actually starting to fight this before COVID happened, with a lot of opposition. But for us now to say, let's sue China because they withheld medications that they make for us, which that's ludicrous, because we shouldn't even allow them to make national security type product, such as medications, many electronics devices, anything that can affect our economy on such a large scale. That, and it actually ends up including everything. Yeah, I mean, during Desert Storm, we found out that, guess what? They're making our country's military uniforms. How ludicrous is that? And then there's, on top of that, there's the misinformation, which is a 180 departure from what we had been being told, instead of them withholding information about how serious this COVID-19 is. And now it's coming out that they actually put scare tactics into our society, saying, this is going to be much worse, so that we're spending a lot of money gearing up for something that's really not all that bad. Now, which is it? And nobody in American public really knows, except the people on the front line. I live in the Northeast, so I hear from people family members and close relatives and family of relatives who work in the medical industry. A lot of my direct family work in the medical industry, and are dealing with the sorrows of the people that are dealing with the deaths and the extreme illness that this disease causes. And it's to them, there's no question as the seriousness of this disease.
Yeah, Steve, you're so right. I'm grateful for your call today, Steve, to talk about these important issues that we know more and more every week than we did the week before. Hindsight's always going to be 2020 when we're talking about some of these big picture issues. But it's just so hard to know in a world where information is pivotal to saving lives in real time. What's truth, what's fact, and what I'm starting to ask, which is what does accountability look like moving forward? And I know our governing officials are starting to ask that. We know that President Trump has had his eye, as you mentioned, Steve, on China and the NAFTA agreement specifically. And I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that in the middle of this crisis, when he's already starting to withhold funding from the World Health Organization for misinformation and for the way they've handled this, that he will seek retribution. I think the time is coming where he's going to hold China accountable. I'm sure they're still deciding what that looks like. I know that Senator Tom Cotton wants to really start working on getting pharmaceuticals back here in the United States, where we can rely on our own infrastructure to supply our own needs on these fronts. So those are the big important questions to be asking. And I'm sure, that our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said that China, Russia, and Iran are all involved in disinformation campaigns related to the pandemic. So I know that our top security officials are also taking a look at this, and I'll be curious to see where that heads in the months and probably years even to come. But we're going to shift gears here on the Millennial Roundtable and talk a little bit more specifically about the economic situation that our millennial generation is facing. We are statistically right now being laid off and furloughed, and our unemployment rate is higher than any of the other generations' unemployment rates right now because of this economic crisis. And there was a great article on this in The Atlantic. We have it on pointofview.net for you to read, that talked about how millennials specifically, we did everything by the book, right? We went to college for the most part, and we got good grades, and we entered the workforce in a time in 2008 when there was an economic recession, and how joblessness, that impacted us. We started with lower salaries than generations had for 20 years, 30 years before us. And this is not to complain, but it's just, or cry about it. Every generation has faced its own challenges, some warfare and death in other ways, but millennials have faced severe economic challenges, and for the first time in history, will be potentially the worse off economically than the generation before it. For the first time in history, the poorest generation before the previous one. And so these are really significant. And I know that Shane, you and Jonathan both work with millennials. What were your thoughts when you read this article and really started thinking big picture about what two economic recessions means for us in our short adult life, Shane?
Yeah. And I love working with millennials and Generation Z coming up after that you mentioned earlier. And my heart really breaks for our generation in the sense of, like, I don't want it to be poor, pitiful us, right? But think about if you're even a 20-year-old college student, you've already lived through 9/11, the 2008 Great Recession, and now COVID-19. Like, you've experienced more as a young adult in the formative years of your life than a whole lifetime should ever see, right? And so I feel like millennials, the next generation, they know there's a huge problem. I think that's why some are so desperate for a solution and truth. We talked about the importance of truth a while ago. And then I think this also can be a learning time of okay, we really do need to work on some of our commitment levels, because even before COVID, the average millennial, by the time they were 40, had already 14 different jobs, And so I think there is some value of building some equity in a position, building some trust with an organization or a corporation that you're with. And then so many of our generation want to be freelancers. They don't really want to be tied down to a business or corporation. You want to be a part of many things. And so when those things are shut down, so are you. You know what I mean? And so I think this is an opportunity where I think it stinks, feel bad, we hurt, but also what can we learn from it and come out better on the other side of it?
That's so true. Jonathan, did you have anything to add?
No, I love, Shane's right on, Chelsey. And I think, when we start thinking about in the context of where, myself and Shane are trying to lend influence and to maybe just point young adults and really folks across the age ranges towards, kind of where do we go next year, particularly spiritually. I think churches just have a massive opportunity right now. I mean, what better time than now to speak into the issues of financial coaching and stewardship? And I don't just mean giving, Chelsey, although that's a big deal, because to Shane's point, this idea of being non-committal and, man, I'm going to, my money's mine, not anybody else's, and I'm going to give you what I want. I'm going to demand transparency, but I'm not going to offer it, and all these different kinds of things that I think young adults have drifted into this idea that you have to be completely vulnerable. I don't. And my litmus test for trusting you is how willing are you to first earn my trust through who you are. And I get that, and that's real. but maybe this is a time for churches and church leaders and disciple makers to say, hey, we're going to offer some ways for us to help give you some life-giving coaching and disciple-making practices and relationship-building opportunities to help you understand. You may not have a lot right now. Maybe you're unemployed between jobs, or like Shane said, the gig economy has become a moving target. But we're going to help coach you with what you have to make the most of it. I think that could be a huge opportunity moving forward.
Great points from Jonathan Teague. Well, stay tuned, because right after this, we're going to be back continuing to talk about millennials and the economy right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'm Chelsey Youman, and I'm your host today for the Millennial Roundtable on Point of View. And we've got a couple of stellar millennials around the table with me. Jonathan Teague with Prestonwood Baptist Church here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but also Shane Pruitt with the National North American Mission Board. And we've just been talking about this Atlantic article that's on pointofview.net if you want to look it up for our listeners, but that this is the second big recession that millennials as adults have faced in their very short adulthood. So when we first graduated college, when I graduated my law firm, even firms were on from law school, firms were on hiring freezes. And so we were hard pressed to find jobs. And when we did get jobs, they were paying half of what you would think a lawyer should be making. And that story is true of most professions for graduates. And then we also were the first generation to graduate with unprecedented amounts of student debt. Now, we're not saying all of this to say, cry me a river, millennials, how hard has it been for you? But we are saying that historians are starting to say we'll be the first generation that will be worse off economically than the generation before it, and that this has massive implications long term for us because we have less of a savings, there are less assets for our generation in general, less nest eggs and retirement to rely on. And those are all some pretty big obstacles that we're going to be facing as a generation. So, Jonathan, we were going to talk about that and really what you think and what you're seeing, because you do minister to young married adults who are in our generation. Really what implications you see this having from your standpoint.
Well, yeah, Chelsey, and just to circle back on something that Shane said a minute ago that I thought was so great is just this whole issue of commitment, particularly amongst young adults, and delayed marriage age, having kids later, and all those different implications there. And, obviously, dual income couples trying to navigate homeschooling. I've got 4 kids. We are literally running, Shane, we are running a real live homeschool right now at my house. It is so real. And we're loving it. But, Chelsey, it's new layers of how we approach life and what we're doing. I don't know. I just think that, again, I kind of come back to that. What the Lord's really put on my heart during this season is that, yes, this is certainly a real time. It's in a lot of ways, it's a scary time. But I just think that God uses these moments to open up our hearts to maybe doing things in a different way. And I just think, Shane, I love what you said about, sort of circling back on values in local churches and even, Chelsey, in your business life and even in the government space, in the political space, of just sort of this idea that, commitment is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's not something to fear. It's something to embrace, whether it's being part of a community or a community of faith. And I think one of the things that, coming back when churches in particular start to worship again live and in person, I think that's one of the things that we ought to be talking about is, hey, you know what, you have a place here, you have value here, and even the idea of membership and being a part of something bigger than yourself. That I know for the number of young adults that are single that our church is continuing to minister to, that's the number one issue, Chelsey, we're seeing is just the ongoing isolation and the loneliness and separation, anxiety, literally, that's being created through this process.
Yes, there's so many ways that we are interconnected as a society that I don't even think that we realize. Our generation tends to have less of that village that they talk about when it takes a village to raise your family. We have less close friends than in generation before it. We're a little bit more isolated in general, but I think that this has just highlighted how interconnected we still really are and should be with our communities. And I know in the state of Texas that the governor and Attorney General Paxton are saying, okay, churches, it's time to reopen your doors, allow worship, minister to your communities again. And then here's some guidance for what the health officials say are going to be the best ways to go about that. But it is time as a society to continue to move forward and serve one another. And when we think about what the hospitals are reporting, increased severe abuse on children, while there's a lot of ways that when kids are home in their volatile homes instead of at school, there's a price to pay. Suicide rates are up, depression rates are up. Now that's all scary things, but that's things that we as a society, we have to look at, and we can't just silo this issue and say, well, there's a virus at hand and that's the number one threat to society. There are other costs being paid in other facets of society that we really should be looking at and service oriented. I'm in the pro-life movement at Human Coalition Action, and we have increased 94% women in crisis calling us in crisis, actively seeking an abortion. And we're trying to talk them off the ledge and work with them and meet their tangible needs. But there are huge opportunities that we have to serve women and children and anyone really among us who really needs to be served. Shane, are you seeing that as well in your ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and to go back to what you were talking about, millennials, and man, Jonathan, what he said was so spot on of the importance of being committed and committed to a faith family and a local church. Here's something's really exciting, I think, in this time is is the Billy Graham Center released a survey where they interviewed unchurched people who are not going to church or been a part of a church and said, hey, do you expect to see yourself attending a local church in the future? And listen to this, 39% of millennials who are unchurched right now expect to be regularly attending a church in the future. And you're like, 39%, I wish it was more than that. But when you think of how many millennials there are, that's 25 million of them expect to be regularly attending a church in the future that don't currently do it now. And they were the largest percentage of any other generation when asked, said they do see themselves in a church in the future, which to me is exciting. Now, the question is, like, when we are able to start physically gathering again, what will that look like? You know, a couple of weeks ago, I traveled to a church to preach for a church through a video camera, of course. And I'm a huggy guy. The pastor of that church is a huggy guy. So when I walked in, he said, Shane Pruitt, and he gave me this big hug. And like, in that moment, I froze.
Like,
I froze. And normally I would not think that was weird at all. But in that moment, I froze because I'm like, the only one who's hugged me in the last 2 months is my wife and kids, you know? So in that moment, I froze. And so I don't think we fully understand the mental effect this has on us until we start getting around people again. Like, will handshakes be a thing of the past?
How awkward are we going to be socially for a while?
Hugs, right? You know, and you know, and I'm praying and thanking God in this time for medical professionals and first responders. You know, they're the heroes, and we talk about them a lot. But I'm also praying for pastors and counselors and therapists because I think they'll be responding to COVID for years.
I think so. I mean, my mom, she is she's an LPC counselor and in a school district nearby. And, you know, there's a lot happening in kids' homes, and my heart goes out to that. And we continue to pray for that. But we as a society, I mean, we will be stronger, and we know we have a hope in the Lord, and our listeners know that. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just continue to, I just have not been afraid. I am due with my third child in 2.5 weeks. He is coming, ready or not. And I'm still not afraid. And I keep thinking, like, maybe I should really, like, be more concerned. But at the end of the day, I just know, like, I have a hope in the Lord, and he's bigger than all of this. And I just hope that everyone can check on your neighbors, check on those in your small communities around you. It's a great opportunity. Just go door to door if you can. Make some phone calls, especially for people who are, like, living alone right now, or anyone you know might be struggling, just to reach out and continue to be the community we're called to be as believers. We are rounding out the hour here. So real quick, I wanted to let Jonathan, you just have the floor to say your social media platforms, where you're from, where people can hear more from you.
No, yeah, and Chelsey, it's been awesome to be with you and Shane today, and always a blast to be with you guys. Yeah, I mean, my wife's kind of our Facebook representative, but I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and part of our faith family here at Prestonwood, and you know, just continuing to press forward and just helping. Particularly for me, a big point of emphasis in my ministry is just intergenerational discipleship, bringing the generations of the church together. We're doing some work with a graduate program at SMU right now, and the life of our church, and just some other things that we're doing to, you know, just help generations of the church see that we can learn from each other, grow together, and grow in our faith together as we love one another well. So
great.
Pray for us as we do it.
Great. And thank you, Shane Pruitt, for joining us.
It's an honor.
We're so happy to have you. And you can find all of their information on our website, pointofview.net.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.